So just a disclaimer, this is actually only one part of a series I'm making that's going to be compiled into a larger video. So be sure to start from part one, but also to look out for the entire compilation. Thank you for watching. Conjuration. We already touched on Conjuration a little bit, but now we'll have a dedicated look at it. It can often be mistaken for transmutation, even in universe. So while I will bring up the differences, I'll try not to harp on all of them here since I already went into detail for some of them within the last section. The first most obvious difference between conjuration and transmutation is the effects they create in the water divination test. When a transmuter performs a test, the water doesn't change physically, even though the flavor does. But with conjurers, there's a tangible, physical, visible change in the water as impurities form within it, a reflection of how transmutation is used to change the qualities and or shape of one's aura, but conjuration is used to form actual objects and substances. Conjuration, of course, allows for the creation of physical objects and materials out of one's aura, and there are plenty of examples of this being done within the series, such as Kurapika conjuring chains. However, it is clear that conjuration can also be used to manifest something in place of or alter existing physical objects. For example, in chapter 391, the character Padella, I've never actually had to pronounce that name out loud, so I have no idea how to pronounce his name. He is a conjurer who is granted the ability Fistful of Weapons, I'm Coming to Get You, by Mora's Contagion. Said ability allows him to turn his right hand into a variety of tools, such as a hammer and drill. Heinrich Duffno can use conjuration in the form of his ability Biohazard, set in the palm of your hand to turn inanimate objects such as cameras, guns, and handcuffs into animals. These constructs even seem to have the functions of the object they originally were. For example, in chapter 391, Heinrich turns a camera into a cat, but the cat seems capable of recording like a camera in regards to what it sees for when it's turned back into its original form. The ability to change physical real objects would probably also explain part of the reason Kurapika's chains seem to change length when he slings them around sometimes. He's probably using conjuration to make more chain links or extend the length, and in chapter 77, Kurapika even makes one of his already conjured chains bigger. If conjuration couldn't directly affect existing objects, then it's more likely that Kurapika would have to dispel the chains and materialize them again, but he doesn't. So we know that you can at least change existing conjured objects via conjuration. This might also explain how Owl's conjured Fun Claw shrinks things that are caught within it. Hey, it's me, Doug, from the future to add an extra note to my argument, because I actually have more points I can make that point to transforming yourself or other objects as being a conjuration thing, and not a transmutation thing. First off, it's important to remember that transmutation is changing your aura properties specifically, which means a non-user cannot see it. This alone severely limits what kind of transmogrification or disguise type stuff transmutation alone can perform, since while conjuration can be made visible or invisible, something that is transmuted cannot be made visible directly. This is not to say that transmutation cannot have visible effects. For example, Killua's aura can cause hair to stand up when given the properties of electricity due to mimicking the static, and I'm sure that if you transmuted your aura into being as hot as fire, it would visibly burn things. But conjuration can be used to create actual physical mass that is visible to everyone. If it was solely transmutation being used in order to do something like transform your appearance, or turn into something else, then there's a pretty good chance that non-users would not see it, or it would look way different to them, which is more likely to be mentioned and much less likely to be a good disguise. Additionally, all users we have seen with abilities that transform themselves into vehicles are actually conjurers, not transmuters. According to Togashi's exhibition puzzle, the Zoldyck butler, Tsubone, is actually a conjurer that sits next to Kite. Now, she does have a lean towards transmutation, so I'll give people that. There's also the side character Kurtan during the Succession War. While this character has very little screen time, Bill confirms two things about this character in chapter 361. First, he is a conjurer, and his second ability is quite similar to Tsubone's Rider's High, in that it allows him to transform into at least one vehicle. In this case, a boat that can carry up to 5 people, that is then fueled by their aura. The aura of the people riding the boat, that is to say. Now, someone could argue that even though all the characters I mentioned are conjurers, that doesn't necessarily mean they're using conjuration, or only conjuration. But I think the reasoning only goes so far when we have characters like Heinrich, who can turn a camera into a full-on cat, and basically every single character we've seen with this flavor of transmutation is a conjurer. So if you think all this transforming stuff is strictly transmutation, you'd have to argue that basically none of these conjurers are using conjuration at all, which is way different than a one-off character not using the Nen type they have an affinity for. Some people might try to argue that Hisoka is proof a transmuter can directly change their body, since after his fight with Chrollo in chapter 357, it recreates destroyed parts of his body with bungee gum. However, this would be a misunderstanding of what Hisoka is doing if you argue it proves transmutation can alter physical objects directly. Firstly, Hisoka is not altering his flesh to create new parts or shaping existing flesh. He's shaping his bungee gum into what is basically an aura adhesive to stop the bleeding, along with an aura prosthetic that he can control while it is attached to his body, but not directly transforming his body. Secondly, in order to give the illusion his body is whole, he is actually using the conjuration ability Texture Surprise to give the appearance of skin and or flesh. Texture Surprise is also stated to only work on thin flat surfaces, at least before Hisoka died, and we have seen it used on things like napkins and paper, making it yet another example of Conjuration altering a physical object if we use chapter 55 as reference. If he was only using transmutation for this feat, to Nen users, Hisoka would look like a corpse with some bubblegum stuck onto it. And to non-users, he would stick out like a sore thumb, because he would be a corpse that is somehow walking around and grabbing things, even with the hand that has no fingers. What's probably allowing Hisoka to move these transmuted body parts is the fact that transmutation can be used to control and shape aura, as we mentioned previously. More specifically, Hisoka has demonstrated the ability to make bungee gum contract, and how our muscles allow us to move is a complicated process of contracting and relaxing. So even if you want to use this scene as a case for transmutation being able to transmute anything, not just aura, Hisoka is still using Conjuration. So at best, in order to transform physical objects, you still can't solely use transmutation. Even then, I think there are enough examples of conjurers we know or can presume are using Conjuration to transform objects. So it's certainly possible to do it with just Conjuration, while it seems impossible to do it with just transmutation directly. The only possible concrete argument I can think of to potentially dispute this is Bisky and her ability to alter her form because she's a transmuter. However, we don't have an actual confirmation of what Nen type she's using in chapter 375. She says even she herself has no idea how it works, but she acquired it over time little by little. So the use of Conjuration for this ability isn't actually ruled out, and while it could be specialization or even manipulation, I've already given plenty examples of Conjuration being used to alter bodies in appearance and or shape. Additionally, while Bisky is a transmuter, transmutation is in fact right next to Conjuration on the Nen chart, meaning it's not too much of a stretch that if a transmuter like Hisoka can use the category to great effect, then someone like Bisky could too, even if potentially unconsciously. Now, I'm sure you could do some extreme transformation by using Conjuration to change your body, and transmutation to change your aura, but I just don't think this is a requirement for literally every transformation. In chapter 374, Kurapika explains that conjurers can also excel at creating laws and rules and affixing them to an area. This might sound confusing at first, since exerting control over something or someone else sounds like it would be under the domain of manipulation. But it appears that rules and laws made with Conjuration don't involve infusing aura into a target like manipulation would. We also get an example of what Kurapika is talking about in regards to Conjuration and law enforcement with the character Yokotani in chapter 399. Morona's contagion granted him the Conjuration ability A Battle of Wits, LSDF, and narration explains it is a, quote, a defensive ability only usable in the hideout when Morona is present. It activates when Yokotani introduces himself to unlawful intruders. The conjured guards cannot harm the target, but the target's attacks also have no effect, unquote. When Yokotani sends these soldiers to attack, they say, caution level 4, 2 targets charged with breaking and entering, and attempted murder, before Yokotani has them carry out a sentence of eviction to throw Nobunaga and Heinrich out of the hideout. So it would appear that the ability can be activated in response to someone breaking the law when entering the hideout. It's also not outside the realm of possibility that a conjurer could, say, create a room and give the room certain conditions or situations it can react to. Another example of what Kurapika could be referring to would be an ability like Chitu's, which can conjure an entire landscape that the people inside cannot leave until they finish a game of tag in chapter 245. Chitu is also a good example of Conjuration being used to create entire landscapes that are cut off from the outside world, also seen in chapter 245. The Hunter x Hunter Phantom Wiki claims that Conjuration can also be used to create pocket dimensions, but I'm not 100% sure if that tracks. It's possible they are arguing that Owl's Cloth or Chitu's tag game utilized some sort of pocket dimension, but I can't find anything confirming that. They are probably referring to Na's hide and seek, which involves using a Nen space, and while I personally wouldn't be surprised if the physical rooms are created via Conjuration, especially since it doesn't appear to be a normal building and is described as an artificial Nen dimension / space in chapter 246, so we know it is an artificially created space of some sort and not merely just an existing building that people are being teleported to and from. So my personal guess is that Nav is conjuring a simple set of rooms and uses a mission to teleport people to and from it. This lines up with how, in chapter 374, Kurapika also explains that the ability to isolate and completely cut off spaces is a specialty of emitters and conjurers. This could be the thing that the wiki is referring to, and to me, it reinforces the idea that Nav is probably using a combination of emission and conjuration for his hide and seek. Conjuration is create a physical room with a mission to act as a way to bring people in and or out with a mission, and or conjuration being used to cut off the space from the outside world. And it's not like the idea of emitters making use of conjuration, despite it being opposite of emission on the chart, is a foreign concept. For example, in chapter 347, Ging seems to identify the gun-wielding attackers as emitters that are using conjured guns to unleash a barrage of projectiles, and says even though they're emitters, they're the type that would conjure guns, implying that it is possible but not recommended, even if we later learn that their weapons are actually conjured by Golem and not the wielders themselves. According to Nobunaga in chapter 398, while conjurers can create special areas with specific rules, teleportation leans too much into emission. So emission is definitely more of the teleport category, even if both conjuration and emission have ways of sealing off areas. In the first and second version of this article, I claimed that a page on chapter 82 stated that it was manipulators that can pour the most ore into an object, but after embarrassing myself on Reddit, Someone explained to me that this was a typo / mistranslation in the reference I was using, and in both the anime and manga during Uvagen's battle with Kurapika, he says only a manipulator or conjurer could pour so much aura into an object, implying that both conjurers and manipulators can pour the most aura into objects, which makes sense in both cases because we know manipulation involves infusing aura into a physical object, and conjured objects are those literally made out of physical aura. Not to mention that conjurers can literally change physical objects from one thing into another. Either way, guess who's going to need to read through 100 pages of writing for like a third or fourth time at this point, while checking the translations of some of the pages used as reference. Never say I don't care about accuracy or that I don't do anything for you. The affinity spread for conjurers is a 100% in conjuration, 80% in transmutation, 0% in specialization, 60% in enhancement and manipulation, and 40% in emission. Unlike transmutation, conjuration abilities seem to be capable of having a level of object permanence to them that raw aura does not, and they can be seen by non-users because they are physical objects. However, this isn't always true. It doesn't seem to render emission redundant. Some conjuration abilities may require the user to be within a certain distance or supply aura as a sort of restriction, and it is possible to render conjured objects invisible with techniques like In and potentially certain abilities / conditions, such as when Kurapika hides his conjured chains with in chapter 82. In chapter 108, Kurapika states that while his chains are conjured, he does use manipulation and emission with Judgment Chain as a way to enforce a condition onto the target that must be followed, and control the blade involved from a distance. He also states that normally, this would be impossible for him to do since removing the chain from its fasting point would cause it to lose all its energy and force. This could imply that every instance we see of a conjured object being separated from the user actually involves emission in the Hatsu. But then you have cases like Yukatani in chapter 399. Yukatani is another character who was granted an ability by Mortis Contagion, and it's stated by the narration to just be a conjuration ability. Despite this, Yukatani's LCF seems to be able to chase Nobunaga a decent distance. Additionally, it seems like Kurtopi can create copies of an object without emission, but this isn't directly stated, so I might be wrong. It's possible that what allows Yukatani's LSDF to persist is the limitation that can only be used in certain areas while Morena is present in said area, because it's within range of some end-style aura effect. I would be surprised if that was the case because of how his net is portrayed, or because of how the summons are conjured and function. They might be something akin to actual robots, people, Nembeasts, etc. that can keep operating without Yukatani being directly within arm's reach. My personal reading is that some conjuration abilities dissipate if they are too far from the user, but others can persist due to being actual objects. However, without something like a mission, if they are too far, they may literally just act like the normal objects they are, or lose any special net abilities, because some may need aura as fuel to do whatever it is they need to do. Additionally, categories like emission and manipulation allow you to directly control and influence these physical aura constructs from a distance. However, even in these cases, conjuration still involves creating actual objects or substances in their entirety, and not just picking and choosing traits like you might with transmutation. This makes conjuration a bit limited in some respects, since you have to be more considerate of things like physics, even if there are clever ways to circumvent it. This also tends to make conjurers more reliant on things like conditions, limitations, and vows to set their Nen constructs apart from just normal everyday objects by strengthening them or giving them strange Nen properties. According to Izunabi in chapter 83, it's impossible to make something that is, quote, overly supernatural, unquote, with conjuration, and you cannot make something like a sword that can cut through anything and everything. Kurapika puts it another way when he correctly answers Izunabi's question by saying one cannot make things that go beyond the human abilities, such as the sword that can cut through anything I just mentioned. Such an object couldn't be conjured. It's in this explanation that we can see why conjurers tend to be more thoughtful. A good conjurer kind of has to be, and your items have to be considered carefully. Kurapika and Izunabi confirm that while you can't summon a sword that cuts through anything, you could summon an extremely sharp and durable sword. However, if that is literally all it has going for it, you might as well just buy yourself a good saber and reinforce it with aura, even if you couldn't make it disappear and reappear like a normal Nen construct for convenience, as explained in chapter 83. As Izunabi says, quote, in short, conjuring already existing objects doesn't always make an effective weapon. In other words, it's difficult to make things better than God did. The users of conjuration have in their hands a force that's basically difficult to master in fights. Unquote. Izunabi tells Kurapika that while he can't make an unbreakable chain with conjuration, something close to it is possible with the right conditions and limitations. We see Kurapika achieve this by putting conditions and limitations on his chain jail to make it strong enough to bind even the physically strongest Phantom Troop member, the enhancer Uvoken. This does also tell us that conjurers can obviously make more supernatural creations if done correctly. We have seen people conjure Nembeasts or entities that seemingly otherwise don't already exist in the world of Hunter x Hunter, as far as we know anyway. Like Kite's Crazy Slot's clown or Abangane's weird exorcism creature. And we have seen weird things like Shizuku's Blinky, which takes the form of a vacuum Nembeast that can inhale a seemingly infinite number of inanimate objects at the cost of not being able to inhale living things or things made with Nen. Plus, Blinky can only spit up the very last thing it inhaled, and Shizuku can't bring anything else back. Where all the items inhaled by Blinky go is unknown, so it's not clear if they're being turned into something else, teleported somewhere else, taken to some conjured space, digested, or what. When giving a heads up about Yokotani's LSDF in chapter 406, Nobunaga describes it as a counteractive type ability in which attacking it triggers some sort of invincibility switch and level up. I'm not sure if this would confirm that a construct like LCF is literally invincible, because it could just be absurdly durable and strong, like Kurapika's chains, and it's possible that it's just really hard to destroy. Alternatively, more likely given how the narration explains ability, what allows for its indestructibility could be that it can't hurt its targets as a trade-off, so it cannot hurt its targets in any way and vice versa. So the target has their form of indestructibility from LCF itself, and the ability cannot hurt them. Feature Doug here. This actually isn't the first time we've gotten indestructible Nen constructs. In Chapter 211, Knuckles says that attacking APR/pot clean directly is useless because it is invincible. However, it cannot harm the person it is attached to directly. So it would seem that it is in fact possible to create indestructible constructs with the right restrictions. However, the trade-off always seems to be that these constructs cannot directly harm people, and pot clean works from Knuckle actually giving his opponent some of his aura as a loan, which acts as a trade-off. So you can make indestructible constructs, but not a sword that can cut through anything. Also, in both cases of Knuckles' APR and Yokotani's LCF, they are temporary constructs that do not exist perpetually. They do whatever their job is and then disappear. Not to mention they all have abilities that only actually harm you upon breaking an established rule of some kind. I also doubt you could make indestructible full body armor with no weaknesses, since in both the cases of Knuckle and Yokotani, you can attack the user directly or before they activate the ability. Cortopi's own ability, Gallery Fake, allows him to conjure replicas of an object from his right hand as long as he touches it with his left. In Chapter 103, it is stated that these replicas will always disappear after 24 hours pass, no matter the size. We have no concrete size limit for what can be copied, and Cortopia has copied multiple full-size buildings, although I have to imagine creating bigger objects requires more aura. In Chapter 108, Cortopi says his copies are like a form of N, allowing him to detect if someone entered one of his copied buildings. But I can't be 100% sure that this doesn't somehow involve other types of Nens, such as a mission or only works on things in range of his aura. I think all this together tells us that it's useful to think of conjured objects like an extension of one's Nen/aura, and you could use this to your advantage to give them supernatural properties. The most obvious example would be being able to make your conjured objects appear and disappear, since the objects are made of aura given physical form, and aura is normally invisible and not just a physical object. It makes sense that you may be able to return a conjured object into the aura it is made out of. Like all forms of Nen/aura, conjured objects can be affected by vows and restrictions, or can act as extensions of other techniques, such as N, and N can be used to hide conjured creations like any other flow of aura. Conjuration can be used to physically transform one or more parts of your own body or other objects, but Nolnop is presumably using conjuration in the form of his metamorphosis ability to change his appearance in Chapter 405, since anyone and everyone can see the change, even non-users on the Black Whale. And going back to what I said earlier about conjuration being like an extension of someone's aura, we have also seen conjured objects pass through solid objects, which seems a little weird at first. Like for example, Kurapika's chains can pass through Ubogen's body and to wrap around his heart, which seems a little weird at first, but then if you consider the fact that normally aura is not always a physical thing and can sometimes pass through physical objects, it makes more sense. Conjuration can be combined with other Nen types for different effects, such as the healing chain Kurapika made by including enhancement that was shown off in Chapter 84. Although using it while his eyes were scarlet is probably why its healing was so effective, like with Judgment Chain's effectiveness. Unlike some of the other Nen types, we don't get to see Biscuit's conjuration training. We do get some details of the conjuration training Kurapika had to go through under Izunabi in Chapter 123. In Kurapika's case, it involved deciding on the object he wanted to conjure, a chain in this case, before spending a bunch of time with the real chains day and night. He then began to close his eyes and visualize the chains, made sketches of the chains, touched the chains, caressed the chains, and committed them to his five senses before he started having dreams of chains, and then getting full-on hallucinations and subconsciously summoning a chain. This also potentially involves understanding how it tastes, since Kurapika mentions coming with the object to all five basic senses. And I've seen people assume that this means you have to know how something tastes in order to conjure it, but I think the actual point of the training is that in order to conjure an object, you typically need to have an incredibly good understanding of what it is, what it's made of, and how it works, unless you're some kind of Nen genius that can intuit how to make these things on the fly, have some specific ability, or proper restriction. The conjured things in question usually have to be something that can actually function, which relates to Izunabi's comment about being unable to conjure overly supernatural things. Transmuting a car would just involve shaping your aura into a car and making it roll like one. But if you wanted to conjure an entire car, the car in question usually has to be able to actually run properly and have the necessary working pieces, unless you compensate properly with the inclusion of some other Nen type, limitations, vows, restrictions, etc. being applied correctly. According to Hiso's personality test, conjurers tend to be overly serious, stoic, and nervous. They are very observant and logical, rarely falling into traps. Being able to analyze things calmly is a strength of conjurers. Many of the items that conjurers create are often used by them deliberately, practically, and logically. Hopefully you can see how this might actually make a lot of sense considering the nature of conjuration. It takes a lot of consideration and thought to make a conjuration ability that is practical and functional. Conjurers have a stronger tenor around the body part that activates their favorite abilities, but a gentler flow of aura everywhere else, probably correlating to the part of the body and aura they use to create their conjured object. The fact that conjurers typically want to keep their dominant hand free is most likely because they conjure physical things they can/need to interact with or wield for their abilities. If we look at Conjuration from a more thematic perspective, we can see an obvious theme on physicality. When a conjurer does the water divination test, impurities form within the water, creating substances/objects like conjuration abilities tend to do, something that can be physically seen in the water. Conjuration also seems to have a theme of paying close attention to detail. Once again, this makes sense since conjurers are actually creating objects and need to be mindful of that. Conjurers also usually need to have a really good understanding of how even simple objects work and behave, as we see with Kurapika's training. So there's this thread of understanding physical aspects of the world and sometimes even understanding how to change them with a sort of groundedness and thoughtful reasoning. Conjuration abilities also seem like they are usually more complex in function than most enhancer abilities, which usually lean towards more simplistic. Specialization. I'm actually going to skip over specialization, even though I said I would tackle the Nen chart in clockwise direction. The reason for this is because a massive part of what specialization is comes down to understanding what the other categories are not. So we'll circle back to specialization after we cover the remaining 9 categories, which you would know if you were paying attention to me, unlike my cold-hearted and distant lover, the Green Island Pirate NPC. Manipulation. In Chapter 61, we are told that if the leaf floating in the water moves upon someone taking the water divination test, they are a manipulator. Wing explains in Chapter 60 that manipulation can be used to manipulate both living and non-living things with aura. This control seems to be exerted by a user infusing their aura into a target, since in Chapter 82, Ubogen says that manipulators and conjurers can pour the most aura into an object. In the original version of this article, due to a mistranslation/typo, I mistakenly state that solely manipulators pour the most aura into an object, but that is actually implied not to be the case. And in Chapter 388, Babaminya says that if Kurapika was using manipulation to force the nodes of other people open, either partially or fully, his aura would be mixed with theirs. This, of course, means manipulators are usually reliant on some sort of physical medium or object to control, such as Kayuto Zoldik's paper, or exert control over other things, like how Illumi controls people with his needles. It can actually sometimes be quite hard to detect if something is under the effects of manipulation. Killua had a needle from Illumi in his head, exerting some control over him for years without really anybody seeming to notice, or at least mention it from what I can recall. And in Chapter 388, Furikov states he cannot tell if Kurapika is using any sort of manipulation to awaken the nodes of his class with only one person as reference. He had to see multiple people to reach a 100% certain conclusion. Not all applications of manipulation are created equal, since how much control one has over a target or medium can depend on various factors, such as the limitations, conditions, etc. of the ability in question. It is also known that the stronger of an emotional connection one has to an object, the better it works as a medium. In Chapter 50, Wing says that part of the reason Gudo controls tops so well is probably because he has a strong connection to his tops. I know Gudo is an enhancer, but Wing confirms that Gudo is also applying a form of manipulation in Chapter 60 to exert some level of influence over the tops and aid in their spinning. So things someone has a strong emotional connection towards tend to work better as a medium or conduit for manipulation, as opposed to random objects. In Chapter 106, Shonak also knows that manipulators still need to develop and master whatever it is they are manipulating, or using to manipulate other things, or else there is a high chance it will lack power and accuracy. There are also some general rules that we know all manipulators, no matter the skill level, tend to be restricted by. There's the first come, first serve rule as explained in Chapter 226. Manipulation cannot be used to control a target that is already under the effects of another user's manipulation, presumably no matter how powerful and or skilled either of them are. Also, generally, the greater the control one can exert over something with manipulation, the more restrictions they need. The more difficult/restricted the condition/limitation is, the greater control afforded. This can range anywhere from a specific limit on how many targets you can manipulate, to what is an eligible target, to even something like having to make physical contact with a target, or just having to pour more aura into something. Some examples of restrictions would be Illumi having to stick his needles into the people he wants to manipulate. Gudo can only control his tops, Morel manipulating the smoke he makes with his pipe, Shonak having his black voice tied to his phone and antenna, the latter of which must be stuck into a target, etc. In-universe manipulators can be quite scared to face in combat, because if you don't know what their abilities are, and their restrictions are, there's actually always a chance they could have something that can control you directly once one or more conditions are met. Meaning unknown or unaccounted for manipulators could have a potential one-shot. For example, if Shonak gets someone with his black voice, or Illumi with his needles, they would just have to make they could just make the person kill themselves, run around till they die, sit still as they attack them, etc. Illumi's ability in particular permanently cripples a manipulated target. An example of how dangerous a manipulator's ability can be at play would be during Chrollo's and Hisoka's fight in Chapter 351. In Chapter 50, Wing also explains that the type of object being manipulated matters too. Complex objects and living beings can be given much more complex and nuanced auras than something more simplistic like a spinning top. In the same chapter, Wing also confirms that the size of an object matters too. The bigger an object, the more auras need to manipulate it. Kind of like how you need more electricity to power bigger machines and devices. Kurapika also confirms in Chapter 372 that messing with someone's memories can be done with manipulation, and is often a symptom of a manipulator's attack. In Chapter 372, 374, and 381, most of it is explained in 372, we get some details regarding different types of manipulation abilities. Although I should clarify that it doesn't seem like one has a natural affinity for any of these manipulation categories or anything, so I don't think it's some kind of miniature nin chart within the larger one. Instead, it is probably merely just meant to group together common traits or conditions manipulation abilities have. So listing abilities involve leaving the free will of a victim intact, but forcing them to operate under a condition that works in the favor of the one doing the manipulating. An example of this given would be rewriting someone's memories while leaving their free will intact so they are operating with incomplete information or can be tricked into doing something. This type of manipulation can be used to influence several targets while also consuming a small amount of aura. Of course, the trade-off is how much control you actually have over the target, since you aren't full on robbing them of their free will. Coercive abilities are simply ones that involve completely taking over the victim's mind and body to exert total control. But it's obviously more limited in how many targets it can control at once, since we know it requires more aura to pull this off. Pseudo-coercive abilities are ones that take over the body of a target while leaving their mind intact or force them into a situation in which they have no choice but to follow the manipulator's orders. Momose's Garden's Spirit Beast is a good example of this. The Nen Beast in question will show up near a target and continuously ask them if they are free. If the target says no, they will eventually have to deal with this process repeating over and over until they agree. Once this happens, the Nen Beast will take control of the host. So basically, while coercive involves your mind and body being puppeted, pseudo-coercive abilities give the illusion of choice, or just railroad someone into following the manipulator's commands by controlling their body, but not the mind or memories. I imagine the downside is that the target is more likely to be able to warn other people of what happened during or after the ability goes off, because their perception and memories aren't being messed with as much. If you control someone's mind or alter their memories, there is less of a chance that they even know what happened, or can warn others and share information. Induction type is apparently what Solly's Nen Beast makes use of, as mentioned in chapter 374. It's not directly explained what this entails, but we can make some assumptions based on what we see of Solly's Nen Beast. Rihan goes over how the beast uses diffusive induction to spread its influence, and while the level of control it has over its victims is weak, it can manipulate a great number of people. We also know that what Solly's Nen Beast does is produce smoke that when inhaled for long enough will turn someone into a carrier with a miniature version of the Nen Beast above their head, and will harbor good favor towards the respective khaki prince. So I assume that the diffusion induction type doesn't completely rob someone of free will, like coercive, but pushes certain emotions or opinions in a certain direction. The fact that it doesn't grant complete control over a target and their actions is probably why it can influence so many people. Maybe it controls a particular target emotion or opinion to get you to like something more or less, but not the mind entirely. I cannot be 100% certain though, and this is just my educated guess. Rihan specifically says that Solly's Beast uses induction through diffusion, so I imagine the diffusion part is how it spreads from person to person and multiplies. According to Google, the definition of diffusion is, quote, the spreading of something more widely, unquote. And induction means, quote, the action or process of inducting someone to a position or organization, unquote. So it's possible that diffusive manipulation abilities are those that spread across multiple targets, like a disease, and inductive ones are those that try to form some sort of group or following. Induction can also mean quote, the process or action of bringing about or giving rise to something, unquote, which takes us back to the original theory of the abilities that target specific emotions or opinions. In this case, inducing them would be giving rise to them or increasing them. Future Doug here once again. I spent a lot of time in the last note going over how Conjuration can be used to create disguises or physical objects. But with that said, manipulation has some ways of doing that too. For example, Illumi can modify his appearance with his needles by what we assume uses manipulation both with and without his needles. I refer to Conjuration as a category that can allow for the Full Metal Alchemist type alchemy that can transform existing objects and or materials, but it goes without saying that manipulation can be used to exert control over objects, and it would by extension probably allow you to do some, quote, alchemy, unquote, by controlling the components of an object or substance. It's also important to consider that even different Nen types can excel at the same things, albeit in different ways, and sometimes with different limitations. For example, as mentioned previously, Kurapika says Conjuration and Emission both excel at isolating and cutting off areas, but characters like Nobunaga tell us that teleportation is an emission thing. Anyway, I suppose a character like Bisky and Bonolanov could be using a form of manipulation to alter their bodies. I mentioned Bonolanov being a conjurer, but apparently that's from a Hunter x Hunter data book, and so many of those have been inaccurate in the past, so take that info with a grain of salt. However, in the case of Bonolanov, he also suddenly gains clothes he did not have before when disguising himself. In the case of Illumi, we don't see him transform into Hisoka, so it's possible he used manipulation to change his face, and then you just receive some clothes from Hisoka. But with Bonolanov, it's hard to imagine that purely manipulation is being used to create a new set of clothes for the disguise. Especially when just conjuring the clothes is something that would make the most sense with a few hoops to jump through, no matter Bonolanov's den type. And who's to say that even in the case of Illumi, just pure manipulation is being used either. Manipulators have 100% affinity for manipulation, 0% for specialization, 80% for emission, 60% for conjuration and enhancement, with a 40% affinity for transmutation. One question I've been seeing floating around a bit is what the difference between manipulation and emission actually is. This is a fair question since manipulation abilities can seemingly also have a lot of range by virtue of imbuing something with aura to carry out orders from a decent enough range, even without emission. Guido doesn't need to use emission for his tops, for example, and it's possible to have a manipulation ability that allows you to actively give orders with things like a device or your voice. The difference is pretty simple though. Manipulation is infusing one's aura into a target, while emission is just separating aura from your body. With emission, you aren't putting the aura into any object. This also means that manipulators usually need some sort of medium to use in the form of something like an object or substance, while emitters won't as often have this requirement. I guess I would put it this way. Manipulation is being able to sort of store aura within an object, like a battery, to control it, and emission is just separating it like a projectile or enveloping something. Emission also includes abilities like teleporting. So if you see someone just lob a bunch of aura at someone, that's emission. But if someone is, say, controlling a physical doll, that is manipulation. Of course, you can also mix these things by doing things like emitting a projectile that once it makes contact with the target grants you control over it. Unfortunately, despite all the info we have on manipulation in the form of its classifications, we haven't yet seen any training regimens for it yet, Bisky or otherwise. Hiso's personality test describes most manipulators as argumentative and logical people that advance at their own pace. They usually want to keep those who they care about safe, but may not listen to what others have to say about it when it comes to their own goal. While enhancers tend to have simple techniques, manipulators often make use of techniques that allow them to control their opponent, such as Illumi's needles, or something inanimate, such as Morel's smoke. Unrelated to the personality test, we have even seen manipulators control their own bodies. In chapter 227, Shalnark sticks one of his needles into himself in order to enter some sort of autopilot mode. So if anyone was wondering, yes, it seems you can use manipulation on your own body. It's also important to point out that manipulation doesn't have to grant complete control over a target. Sometimes it takes the form of basic commands or reactions something is following as opposed to 100% conscious control all the time. Manipulators usually having a broader tent that turns darker if they attempt to shrink it probably relates to how both manipulators and emitters tend to have a bit more range to their techniques, and often have more external range for their aura. In the case of emitters, it comes from the ability to separate their aura from their body, but for manipulators it comes from being able to infuse their aura into a target. It could also be that their aura is sort of stretched from using it to manipulate things that meet a certain condition or range. The tendency to keep the hand they use for their ability free probably has to do with most manipulators requiring something like a physical medium for their abilities, and your hands are probably something you will use to interact with said medium. To me, the overarching themes manipulators tend to have is less clear than some of the other NEN categories, but there's definitely an emphasis on control, which makes sense because manipulation is all about infusing your aura into something as a way to exert control over it. The fact that they advance at their own pace, want to keep loved ones safe, but don't listen to what said loved ones have to say when it comes to their own goals, potentially lends itself to someone who is controlling and does what they think is best for the people around them, like Illumi. When they take the water divination test, the leaf in the water moves, which doesn't sound like the most mind-blowing result because you could achieve the same effect by just blowing on the leaf a bit, even if it is an on-the-nose way of showing that manipulation is about controlling things, such as the leaf in the water. Their propensity to be argumentative and logical could also relate to a desire to control things around them or even control their own emotions. There's a push to have everything calculated and under control. You could also read manipulators following the beat of their own drum as a sort of resistance to being limited by or controlled by outside forces, ironically enough. All of this could be reflected in how their abilities also often involve controlling other people / things. The first come, first serve rule that prevents another manipulator from overriding control of a target someone is already influencing, and in a way, these could be seen as making things advance at the manipulator's own pace for whatever purpose.